At 80, Diana Ross finally breaks her silence on Gordy and the Supremes, revealing pain, secrets, and struggles fans never knew. Could these truths change how we see them forever? Join us as we uncover the truth. How Gordy destroyed the Supreme. The 1960s Motown was a place where legends were made, but dreams were also torn apart. Under the sharp eye of Gordy, the label gave the world stars like Stevie Wonder and Martha Reeves. Yet while he built history, his strict and profit-driven style also broke hearts, and one of the biggest casualties was the Supremes. The journey began in 1961 when the group, then known as the Primettes, walked into Motown with stars in their eyes. At first, nothing came easy for them. Instead of ruling the charts, they found themselves running errands in the studio, singing backup for others, and waiting for their big moment. Gordy only cared about the records that sold, and for a while, the Supremes didn't seem to have that magic. Everything changed when the songwriting team of Holland, Dozier, and Holland stepped in. With their help, the group finally found the spotlight. A first taste of success came in 1963, and soon after, the unstoppable hit about love that went straight to #1 lifted them into the mainstream. But behind the cheers, Gordy had already reshaped the group into something entirely new. In the early days, each member shared the microphone, creating a blend of voices that gave their songs unique flavors. Florence Ballard had a raw, soulful sound, while Mary Wilson brought a softer touch, and Diana Ross carried a crisp, powerful tone. Together, they could do it all. But Gordy saw something different. He decided Diana Ross would carry the group on her voice alone, and with his guidance, she became the center of it all. Songs like the ones that turned into global hits proved him right in terms of numbers, but the choice quietly pushed the other women aside. Florence felt the cut the deepest. She believed Gordy had placed a crown on Diana's head, leaving the rest of them in the shadows. The pressure of endless rehearsals, heavy touring, and Gordy's strict rules added more weight to their lives. When his private relationship with Diana became known, the divide grew wider. Rumors swirled, tempers rose, and personal struggles began to show. Diana herself broke down from the pressure. Florence sank into drinking, and Mary faded quietly into the background. As time passed, the magic began to fade. The songwriting team that had given the Supremes their biggest hits walked out of Motown after a bitter clash, leaving the group without their strongest creative force. Florence's addiction worsened, and Gordy replaced her with Cindy Birdsong in 1967. From there, the transformation was complete. The name changed to Diana Ross and the Supremes, until eventually even that was stripped away, and Diana stood alone as a solo artist, hand-picked and polished by Gordy himself. The Supremes had once been the shining jewel of Motown, the group that gave the label its most unforgettable songs. But Gordy's relentless push for fame and his tight grip on control took its toll. In chasing success, he had broken the very group that had built his empire. Even Diana, the star he had lifted so high, eventually walked away, leaving Motown behind for a new chapter with RCA in the 1980s. Now, you might be wondering why Gordy specifically chose Diana amongst the other girls. Well, to feed your curiosity, you need to keep watching because it's about to get more interesting. Gordy and Diana's love affair. Diana Ross and Gordy's story was one of music, love, and secrets that shaped not only their lives, but the very history of Motown. Their paths first crossed in Detroit, where Diana, still a teenager, leaned on her neighbor Smokey Robinson to help her and her friends Mary Wilson and Florence Ballard land an audition. That small connection led to the beginning of the Supremes at Motown in 1959. And within a few years, Diana Ross's voice was carrying songs like "Where Did Our Love Go?" to the top of the charts. Behind the studio doors and the spotlight, however, something much more personal was taking place. As Gordy poured his energy into turning the Supremes into global stars, his bond with Diana grew. What began as friendship slowly turned into romance, though it was kept quiet from the public. Their relationship was not without its awkward beginnings. Gordy later admitted that their very first night together was far from the picture-perfect moment he had imagined. Nervous and overwhelmed by the fact that he saw Diana as a queen in his life, the evening didn't go as planned. While he felt humiliated, Diana lightened the mood with a joke, showing the easy warmth between them that helped their romance carry on for years. Through the highs and lows, the pair remained close, even as their love story unfolded in the shadows. They shared both passion and partnership, with Diana becoming not just Gordy's muse, but also the star he built much of Motown around. Their relationship stretched into the early 1970s before life pulled them in different directions. Diana later got married to another person, but as she stepped into a new chapter, her connection to Gordy did not fade. The same year she got married, Diana welcomed her first child, Rhonda. Although Silberstein was her husband and raised Rhonda as his own, both he and Diana knew the truth, that Berry Gordy was Rhonda's biological father. For years, this truth was kept close, hidden from their daughter until she turned 13. Only then did Diana and Berry finally share the real story of her parentage, weaving together the complex layers of their relationship with honesty and love. Even after getting married, they continued to work side by side on films like Lady Sings the Blues, Mahogany, and The Wiz, projects that cemented Diana's status as both a singer and actress. But that closeness came at a cost. It weighed heavily on her marriage to Silberstein, who struggled to compete with Gordy's influence in Diana's world. Their connection created a complicated triangle: Berry's demands, Diana's loyalty, and Silberstein's frustration. It was a storm that Diana herself admitted was too much for her first husband to withstand. Since we've already seen what their relationship looked like, let's explore how it aided Diana's music career. Diana's musical journey. Diana Ross's journey began in Detroit in 1959 when a teenage girl with a big dream teamed up with her neighborhood friends to form a little group called the Primettes. They were young, full of energy, and determined to be heard. Their big break came when Motown's Berry Gordy signed them, but fame came with its challenges. And after those challenges, Diana switched into solo. Her solo career exploded right out of the gate. With songs like Ain't No Mountain High Enough, she proved she could stand alone as a superstar. Hit after hit followed: Love Hangover, Upside Down, and her unforgettable duet with Lionel Richie, Endless Love, which topped charts across pop, R&B, and adult contemporary. Diana wasn't just a singer anymore. She had become a force of nature in entertainment. The 1970s also saw her shine on the big screen. She stunned audiences as Billie Holiday in Lady Sings the Blues, a role that earned her critical acclaim. She kept the momentum going with Mahogany, where she not only acted but also delivered one of her most memorable songs, and later with The Wiz, where she took on the iconic role of Dorothy. Her presence was magnetic, her style unmatched, and her ability to reinvent herself made her stand out in every arena. Even as the 1980s brought shifts in music trends, Diana remained in the spotlight. Albums like The Boss and Diana kept her relevant, though her commercial success in the US began to fade. Still, her influence stretched globally, with loyal fans across the world keeping her name alive. A legendary concert in Central Park in 1983, though marred by a sudden storm, only cemented her image as a performer who could command any stage. As time moved forward, Diana continued to record, tour, and mesmerize audiences. Even when the charts no longer reflected her dominance, her live shows drew crowds, proving that her voice and star power never dimmed. In the new millennium, she released fresh projects like I Love You and reminded the world why she remained one of music's most beloved performers. Her impact was celebrated with honors that matched her legendary status. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame with the Supremes, received the Kennedy Center Honors, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, and a Grammy Award for Lifetime Achievement. More than the awards, though, Diana Ross became a symbol of glamour, resilience, and timeless talent. While we celebrate Diana's lifetime achievements in the music industry, it's necessary to explore Gordy's music career and how he got so much power in the music industry. The Motown's magic. Berry Gordy's story after the Korean War didn't start out as a fairy tale. When he returned home to Detroit in 1953, he tried his hand at running a jazz record shop called the 3D Record Mart. The dream didn't last long, as the store quickly failed and forced him to take a job on the assembly line at the Lincoln Mercury car plant. What looked like a setback soon became a turning point. Surrounded by the grind of factory work, Gordy found his love for music sparking back to life. He began writing songs with an energy that couldn't be ignored, and before long his talent caught the eye of rising star Jackie Wilson. Gordy became the pen behind some of Wilson's biggest hits, like Reet Petite and Lonely Teardrops. Those songs didn't just bring success, they marked the start of a journey that would change American music forever. From there, Gordy built something no one had ever seen before, Motown. It wasn't just a record label, it became the heartbeat of a generation. The sound of Motown gave the world unforgettable stars like Stevie Wonder, Marvin Gaye, Diana Ross, The Supremes, The Temptations, and the Jackson 5. Behind the glamorous spotlight stood Gordy, the mastermind who controlled every moving part of the empire. His approach was shaped by the factory life he once lived. Just like cars rolling off Detroit's assembly line, Gordy designed a system where singers, songs, producers, and even dance routines were molded and polished into perfection. Nothing was left to chance. Young performers were trained in how to speak, dress, and carry themselves in public. Stage movements were rehearsed again and again. Lyrics were reshaped to reach wider audiences. Every record released under Motown had a shine that made it impossible to ignore. But that shine came with a heavy cost. Many of the artists who lived inside the Motown machine later admitted they often felt caged in creatively. The formula left little room for experiments or personal freedom. Marvin Gaye, who once stood as one of Motown's brightest stars, clashed with Gordy when he wanted to release his protest-driven album What's Going On. Gordy resisted, saying the music was too political. Gaye eventually broke through and released it, but only after a battle that showed how tightly Gordy held the reins. Control didn't just stop at the music. Money became another sore point for many artists who felt Gordy's hands stretched too far into their pockets. Motown's success was mind-blowing, but the system that created it also carried cracks that some of its greatest stars would struggle against for years to come. So, let's find out what these struggles were all about. The price of Motown's empire. Motown was famous for turning young, unpolished talent into global stars, but behind the glitter and success, many of its artists later admitted they barely saw the money their songs earned. Most were signed when they were still too new to the business to understand contracts. Their records sold millions, but royalties were small, and the real ownership of their music always stayed in the company's hands. Groups like the Four Tops and the Temptations eventually confessed they had no clear idea of how much they were truly owed. Even Diana Ross, Gordy's muse and partner, was not spared from this kind of control. Her career was carefully steered by Gordy himself. He decided what she sang, how she was presented, and the path she would follow, all to protect Motown's reputation and his own vision. To Gordy, the label was bigger than any single artist. He wanted a black-owned company to dominate mainstream radio, shaping stars who could step into any room in America and command respect. And he guarded that dream with an iron grip. Still, many who lived under his rule later asked what the real cost of that dream had been. Nowhere was this more visible than in his complicated relationship with Diana Ross, an action that pushed founding members Florence Ballard and Mary Wilson into the shadows. Ballard, who had been with the group from the start, grew bitter as her role was diminished. Allegedly forced out of the group, she faced a downward spiral that ended in poverty and an early death at only 32. Many pointed to Gordy's obsession with making Ross a star as the reason behind her tragic fall. At the same time, Gordy's sharp eye for talent never faded. In 1968, 5 young brothers from Gary, Indiana arrived at Motown. Among them was a boy whose voice and stage presence felt almost supernatural, Michael Jackson. Gordy instantly recognized his potential. He polished their sound, shaped their image, and presented the Jackson 5 as the next great Motown act. Practically overnight, they became a worldwide phenomenon, with Michael standing out as a prodigy destined to be one of the greatest entertainers the world would ever know. Under Motown's banner, the Jackson 5 became unstoppable. Song after song shot straight to the top. I Want You Back, ABC, I'll Be There. And for a time, their fame even rivaled the Beatles. They were Motown's crown jewel, the group that every child wanted to dance like, and every teenager wanted to scream for. But while the world saw glittering success, the group felt trapped. Their contracts gave them almost no power over their own music. They weren't allowed to write or produce, and their creativity was carefully boxed in. Michael especially felt the weight of those walls. As he grew older, he longed to experiment, to step outside the neat, polished image Motown had built for him. The system, however, wasn't built for freedom. It was built for control. By 1975, the frustration was too much to bear. The Jacksons made the painful decision to walk away from Motown and sign with Epic Records. For Gordy, it was a crushing blow. He had invested not just money, but heart into the group, especially Michael, who he saw as more than an artist, almost like a son. To make things worse, a bitter legal fight meant the group couldn't even keep the name Jackson 5. They re-emerged as the Jacksons, carrying both their talent and the scars of the split. Only Jermaine stayed behind, torn between his loyalty to the label and his marriage to Gordy's daughter, Hazel. For Michael, leaving was the start of something bigger. Away from Motown's tight grip, he finally found the creative freedom he craved. It was the beginning of his transformation into the king of pop, a legend who would reshape music forever. For Motown, however, their departure marked a turning point. It was the moment when one of its brightest creations outgrew the machine that made it. Berry Gordy had built an empire that turned a small Detroit label into a cultural powerhouse. Through Motown, he had launched icons, shattered racial barriers, and pushed black music into the heart of mainstream America. On paper, his legacy looked untouchable, but as time passed, questions grew louder. Artists and critics began to look beyond the hits and the glamour, asking not just what Gordy built, but the cost of building it. Stories of financial unfairness, suffocating creative control, and emotional pressure began to shadow the empire, leaving a complicated truth behind the glittering success. So many Motown stars, even the biggest names like Marvin Gaye, Stevie Wonder, and The Temptations, later admitted that the very system that made them famous also left them frustrated. The label was run like a finely tuned factory, and while that formula created timeless hits, it also boxed in the artists. Songs were chosen, images were crafted, and once an artist stopped bringing in hits, they were often treated as replaceable. Some, like Florence Ballard from the Supremes, were pushed out and never found their way back. Others, like Michael Jackson, had to break free completely just to find the creative space they longed for. Even today, Berry Gordy's legacy divides opinions. Within the black community especially, people still ask if he should be remembered as a visionary who changed the face of music forever, or as a businessman who sometimes put money above the people who gave Motown its soul. Was it truly an artistic revolution, or was it more like a perfectly controlled business model disguised as one? In his later years, Gordy was showered with honors, lifetime awards, and praise. He was called a genius, a trailblazer, a cultural hero, and in many ways, he was. Without him, the voices of Marvin, Stevie, Diana, and Michael might never have reached the world in the way they did. He didn't just build a record label, he sparked a movement, proving that a black-owned company could dominate an industry that had always been closed off. But behind the glittering applause lies another side to the story. The road to that greatness was paved with broken promises, bruised egos, and sacrifices that some artists never healed from. Gordy was a perfectionist and a strategist who knew how to win, but like many empire builders, he didn't always worry about who was left behind in the process. Too many artists have spoken about being controlled, underpaid, or emotionally drained, shining light on the hidden cost of Motown's success. Berry Gordy wasn't a villain, but he wasn't simply a hero either. He was both at once. He had the rare ability to spot magic in voices others might have overlooked, but he also made sure every choice fed the bigger picture he had in mind. That mix of brilliance and cold calculation is what makes his story so unforgettable. Behind every hit he helped shape was a struggle for freedom, and behind every star he created was a person who sometimes paid a painful price for their fame. But as time went on, the results started showing. So, stay tuned to know how it did. Motown's fall and Gordy's later life. By the late 1980s, Berry Gordy found himself standing at one of the hardest crossroads of his life. For almost 30 years, he had built Motown into a powerhouse, the crown jewel of black-owned businesses in America. A label that had carried voices like Stevie Wonder, Diana Ross, and Marvin Gaye into living rooms around the world. But time was catching up with the empire. Music had shifted, new sounds were dominating, and Motown's once untouchable shine was beginning to fade. The same label that had broken barriers and defined a generation was now struggling to keep its place at the top. The year 1988 became the breaking point. Pressure circled Gordy from every direction. The business was no longer as profitable, competition was fierce, and the industry he once controlled so tightly was moving on without him. Whispers turned into protests when word spread that Gordy was preparing to sell Motown. His employees were anxious, his peers were disappointed, and leaders in the black community begged him to hold on. To them, Motown was more than just a business. It was a symbol of progress, pride, and cultural power. The thought of handing it over to outsiders felt like watching history being erased. But Gordy was never one to let anyone else dictate his moves. He knew better than anyone the struggles of keeping Motown alive in a changing world. On June 29, 1988, at the age of 58, he put pen to paper and signed away ownership of his creation. For $61 million, Motown passed into the hands of MCA Inc. and an investment group. To many, it felt like the end of an era. For Gordy, it was survival. He had poured his heart, his sweat, and his vision into this company since its birth. And if selling it meant keeping its legacy alive in a new form, then that was the choice he was willing to make. To understand why the decision was so painful, you have to remember how Motown began. When Gordy first set up shop in Detroit in the late 1950s, America was still heavily divided. The Civil Rights Act had not yet been signed, and black entertainers had very few chances to break into the mainstream. Doors were closed everywhere, and the idea of a black man running a record label that could compete with white-owned companies sounded impossible. Gordy carried that dream anyway. He fought against racism, against doubt, against every sneer when he walked into a radio station trying to get his records played. Out of those struggles came a label that didn't just change music, it changed the way America listened. Motown wasn't the only company bringing black voices to the forefront. Chess Records in Chicago, Atlantic Records in New York, and Stax in Memphis were also producing legends of their own. But Motown stood apart because it was completely black-owned, run by a man who wanted to prove that his community could not only participate in the music business, but dominate it. Critics accused him of softening the music to appeal to white audiences, but Gordy never shied away from his mission. He wanted songs that reached across lines of race, religion, and class. He wanted music that everyone could sing along to, music that could slip past prejudice and land straight in people's hearts. Even as his critics questioned his methods, the world celebrated his results. The string of honors and awards that followed his career spoke to the scale of his influence. In 1988, the very same year he sold Motown, Gordy was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. 5 years later, he received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the CBC, cementing his role not just as a record man, but as a cultural force. The recognition continued through the years. In 1998, he entered the Junior Achievement U.S. Business Hall of Fame, and in 2009, his name was enshrined in the Michigan Rock and Roll Legends Hall of Fame. So what do you think about these unbelievable revelations about Berry Gordy? Do you think setting up Motown caused more harm than good in the music industry? Let us know in the comments section. If you want more interesting revelations about your favorite celebrities, be sure to like, subscribe, and watch the next video shown on your screen. See you there.